time to begin with Rick Kay's paper. So everybody knows the rules, and Rick will be presenting, and John McGinnis will be commenting, and I'll keep the cue.
Thank you. It's very nice and wonderful to be back here in San Diego and enjoying the conference so far. When this paper was accepted for this conference, I was asked by the organizers. They said, "Oh, it's really like the paper, but could you tell me what it has to do with originalism?" And so I said, "Well, I think it does have a lot to do with originalism, and I'll talk about that. I'll emphasize that when I present it, and that's sort of what I'm going to do. And the paper's got a lot of stuff in it, but I'm going to talk essentially about the connection between originalist constitutional interpretation and the notion of constituent authority, which is the theme of the paper. The connection, it seems to me to be that for originalist interpretation, it follows necessarily that the authority of the constitutional text has to be related to a particular historical event. That is, originalist interpretation necessarily attributes critical importance to the moment when the Constitution was created, hence the word original. It follows, then, that we need to consider how we identify those historical events which then are capable of creating binding constitutions. And that's the quality which I investigate in the paper and which I call constituent authority. My assumption in the paper as well is that constituent authority has to be a function of attitudes and beliefs in the relevant society. Well, these days, constituent authority is almost always attributed to the people, though, as the paper outlines, just how you define the people and how that entity, however defined, is thought capable of expressing itself is a intrinsically difficult matter. But I think it continues to be the case, for example, that regard for the United States Constitution still depends on the assumption that it is in some way the work of we the people. That's in both popular culture and I think in much academic writing as well. That being so, I think that when we think then about the people as a constituent authority, it follows that we need to connect what it is about the people as a constitution maker that we like and the actual story of how the Constitution came into existence. So I posit, and I think this is true of at least a lot of people's attitude, that to the extent that the people's constitution making is attractive to us because it represents a form of consent of the governed, then certain problems follow. Mainly because of the rather restrained and the kind of democracy that in fact produced the original Constitution, and even apart from that, from the problem of the passage of 200 years from the time of the Constitution's enactment. These seem to me sometimes, anyway, to require a reconstruction of historical events, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. This idea that the Constitution is the work of a legitimate constituent authority may clarify some unsettled questions about originalist interpretation. I have in mind here the division averted to already many times in this conference between the so-called intentionalist and public meaning versions of originalist. originalism. Again, if we accept the idea that the binding quality of the Constitution is associated with its creation by certain human agents possessing and expressing in the Constitution their will, then I think the intentionalist view fits much more comfortably with that assumption. To put this in a slightly caricatured version, we won't say, I think, we respect the law made by the king, and we respect it because he is the king. We won't say those two things and then say, but we really don't care what he wanted to do when he made the law. So in that particular respect, anyway, the idea of constituent authority may clarify the nature of originalist interpretation, but in another sense, it profoundly complicates it as well. Because, as the historical and comparative examination reveals, constituent authority recognized in a given time and place does not always correspond perfectly with the actual historical events that created the Constitution. And this is a particularly acute problem with the attribution of constituent authority to we the people. Since the fact of the matter is that most constitutions really are the product of negotiation among a relatively small number of actors, and the relationship of the agreement of those actors to some presumed consent of the larger population is always more or less and usually more attenuated. Yet there is no doubt, I think, still, that in these jurisdictions, the force of the Constitution continues to be associated with the recognition of it as the work of the people. Let me stop here to just emphasize one point. When I talk about attitudes that reveal sources of authority, I'm always talking about current attitudes, since what we are investigating is the explanation for the current force of the Constitution. So, if the relevant subject population does regard the Constitution as binding, at least in part because it's the product of a certain human process, then I think if we're thinking about constituent authority, we have to say, well, what do people think that process was? Which may, but often won't, be what actually happened in creating the text. That is to say, constituent authority is a product both of history and of the perception of history. Now, what does this do to originalist constitutional interpretation? The answer to this is I'm really not sure. If we are being faithful to authority, and if authority stems not from actual human agents, but from some current reconstruction of the actions of those agents, that sounds like something far less stable than originalist interpretation has been advertised to be. And if that's true, perhaps this realistic depiction of constituent authority may subvert one of the principal advertised values of the originalist approach. It's a virtue which I think didn't seem to have many buyers at this conference, but nonetheless, it is often associated with originalist interpretation. But nonetheless, for reasons which are only hinted at the end of the paper, I don't think it's as bad as it looks. First, the historical reconstruction that I posit isn't a wholesale confabulation of fictional events. It's not just making up a story about. I don't think that people regard the Constitution of Japan as binding because they think there was a referendum in 1947 in which the Japanese people approved it. Rather, what I'm talking about is people supposing that the actual historical events somehow more faithfully represent national sentiment than an objective evaluation would reveal. With the result that usually the content of the rules so interpreted will be unchanged by the fact that there is a new understanding of the constituent process. But I have to admit that that may not always be the case. Sometimes the malleable quality of constituent authority will provide an opportunity for importing ahistorical values into the process of constitutional interpretation, constitutional application, perhaps I should say. At least where the historical questions are themselves difficult questions, one can imagine an interpreter resolving them by citing the founder's attachment to some value which only exists in the remodeled version of constituent authority. In the end, I don't see any way to avoid this in a long-lived constitution. Nonetheless, having said that, I don't think it dissolves the difference between originalist interpretation and living constitutionalism. I still think originalism can still provide more restraint. As I say at the end of the paper, I think it means that a constituent authority can be more than one thing, but that doesn't mean it can be anything at all. Thanks.